The protagonist loved all fluffy things and wished to spend his entire life surrounded by them, hoping that his dream might come true in the new world where he was being reincarnated. He recalled his past life, when he had been sitting nearby and playing with cats, and a lady had approached him, congratulating him for winning an isekai ticket. He had not understood what she meant, and as she came closer, he had wondered why such a beautiful woman was speaking to someone like him, who had always been lonely with no friends. He had never even had a girlfriend in his entire life, so he questioned how that lady had known about the secret fluffy pet spot where he often stopped on his way home from college. He had stood up and asked whether she was there to get her own fluffy fix as well. She had denied it, and instead offered him a special ticket, the Isekai Reincarnation ticket. Though he had not understood what she meant, she had wished to see him again soon. Without him realizing, he had suddenly been transported into a dark space. When he had woken up, he had heard a baby crying, and the surroundings had been dazzlingly bright, making him wonder what kind of place it was. Then he had noticed a lady calling him Prince Rufus, which made him confused about what was happening. He had been shocked, questioning if the crying voice he heard was actually his own. His parents had already passed away in his previous world, and before he had fully understood anything, he had been reincarnated into a place called Moongard, where swords and magic were real. He was not born as an ordinary noble, but as a prince, and he wondered if that was the true meaning of the special offer he had received. As he grew, his companions were often delighted by everything he did. Believing he had grasped the situation, he continued acting like a baby, just enough to keep those around him from noticing anything unusual. He grew up healthy and strong until the age of 7. At that age, everyone in the world was required to take part in what was known as the skill inheritance ceremony, where one would awaken their unique ability. No one knew what skill they would receive until the ceremony itself. When it was finally Rufus's turn to inherit his skill, his two brothers, Prince Gilliam and Prince Leonard, approached him and asked if he was nervous. As he remained silent, they understood that he was indeed anxious, since everyone was curious about the ability they would obtain. They admitted that they were in the same situation as well. Just as Rufus was about to speak, his two brothers took him by the hands and pulled him inside. He asked them to let go, insisting that he could walk on his own, but they only told him not to be so shy. Inside the room, Rufus saw another boy undergoing the ritual, and to his surprise, his father was watching from nearby. The atmosphere felt like a school open house, and it was incredibly nerve-wracking. When the priest finally called his name, Rufus was told to place his hands on the crystal. He agreed and did as instructed, and the crystal began to shine brightly. The priest then announced that Rufus had awakened the summoning skill. As Rufus heard the murmurs and excitement from the crowd, he wondered if the skill was truly that powerful or important. He also worried about what would happen if he accidentally summoned dangerous monsters. Even if he could summon them, he doubted his ability to control them. If he were to use the skill, he would rather live peacefully surrounded by fluffy creatures like a tamer. His brothers approached him, telling him that he had drawn a rare skill. Realizing it was indeed rare, Rufus asked what exactly the summoning skill was. Gilliam told him that he should ask the Summoners Guild for more details. Rufus wondered about the guild, and Gilliam explained that for skills not yet fully understood, there were research organizations called guilds. He added that there were only a handful of summoning skill inheritors in the entire country, possibly only 2 within the Summoners Guild. The 3 of them then went to the guild. When Rufus knocked, a voice answered that they had been expecting him. The man who greeted them introduced himself as Selbus Tian, head of the Summoners Guild. He bowed respectfully to Rufus as a prince and explained that Rufus's father had already informed him of his arrival. Nearby, a nervous girl introduced herself as Lala. Rufus was stunned, realizing that the Summoners Guild really only had 2 members. Without hesitation, Rufus got straight to the point, apologizing and asking about the summoning skill. Selbus agreed to explain and led him to the library, though Rufus felt the term library was a bit of an overstatement. Selbus browsed the shelves, selected a book, and handed it to him. When Rufus opened it, he realized it was an encyclopedia. As he was about to ask a question, Selbus confirmed his thoughts, explaining that what was written inside referred neither to animals nor monsters. They were called magical beings. Rufus understood that these were creatures he had never once seen in any of the encyclopedias in the royal library. He began to wonder if those were the only beings he could summon. The list seemed small, and he worried that perhaps his ability was actually a poor skill. He then mentioned that he wanted to see someone perform a summoning. Selbus agreed and asked Lala to demonstrate. Flustered, she began to chant, while Rufus silently wished that nothing frightening would appear. To his relief, Lala manifested a marmot, a small and fluffy creature that made Rufus's eyes sparkle with excitement. Overjoyed, he asked if she could summon anything else. Lala apologized, saying that was all she could manage. Selbus added that he himself could call forth one other type of creature. With anticipation, Rufus asked to see it. Selbus then manifested a bird, which perched gracefully on his shoulder. To Rufus's delight, it too was fluffy, and he became even more excited. Rufus immediately asked if he could try as well. Selbus agreed, explaining that to summon magical beings, Rufus would need to use his summoning skill by visualizing the image of the creature in his heart. Once the image was properly formed in his mind, he would be able to call it forth. Rufus thought that if he imagined things in enough detail, it should work. Deciding to try summoning a bird first, he carefully envisioned its form and coloring. The image reminded him of Peep, a Java sparrow he had once cared for in his past world. He even wondered if Peep was doing well back there. As the image solidified, Rufus manifested the bird, and to everyone's astonishment, it really appeared. Rufus was overwhelmed with excitement, while Selbus was utterly shocked, as it was considered impossible to succeed at summoning on the very first attempt. The bird spoke in human language, announcing that she had arrived. Both Selbus and Lala were shocked, and Rufus, equally surprised, understood from their reaction that having a summoned magical being speak was extremely unusual. Rufus greeted the bird, calling her Burden, and wondered why she was able to talk. It wasn't as though he had wished for it directly, yet he recalled that in his past life, he had sometimes imagined speaking with fluffy creatures once or twice. He began to consider the possibility that if his image was strong enough, he might be able to summon beings other than the ones listed in the encyclopedia. And if he truly could summon anything he imagined, what should he do with such power? His thoughts quickly wandered into countless exciting possibilities. Even though his mind was overflowing with wild ideas, he reasoned that since he was only 7 years old, it was not embarrassing to think that way. Driven by that thought, he attempted to summon a red-eyed, white-feathered dragon. Selbus and Lala were completely stunned, and Rufus himself felt deeply embarrassed at what he had just done. Selbus, unable to comprehend it, wondered aloud what such a creature even was. Everyone was shocked because Rufus had truly summoned a colossal dragon, something far beyond anyone's expectations and undeniably more impressive than anything they could have imagined. As Rufus was about to faint, a man stepped forward to support him, and he realized that his body was completely drained. It became clear to him that summoning multiple times would be extremely difficult. He also noticed that Lala was frozen in shock. The dragon spoke, remarking that the place felt cramped and asking if it would be acceptable to break the walls. Rufus, astonished that the dragon could also speak, asked instead if it could make itself smaller, though he knew people would likely call such a request unreasonable. He then asked if the dragon would be willing to work with him. The dragon agreed, but said it required a name, explaining that once Rufus named it, the creature would become his exclusive companion and gain the ability to freely change its body size according to Rufus's command. Rufus immediately understood that this meant he could treat it as a pet, so he gave it the name Ragios. The dragon accepted the name without complaint. Rufus then turned toward the bird he had summoned earlier and asked Ragios to shrink to the same size. Ragios tried, but could only reduce himself to the size of a puppy. Rufus found him unbearably cute at that size, as his fluffy form made him look like an adorable little creature. Ragios admitted that shrinking further was his limit, and that he should probably disappear. He sounded disappointed, feeling he had failed to properly follow his master's command, but Rufus quickly told him to wait, assuring him that this size was perfect. Better, in fact. He thought to himself that his servant was truly loyal. Rufus then asked if Ragios would mind being picked up. Ragios replied that Rufus did not need to ask for permission. Delighted, Rufus lifted him into his arms. On the other hand, Selbus thought the situation was dangerous, that Rufus might actually ascend to the heavens from sheer bliss. He quickly interrupted, warning Rufus that this had become quite serious. He explained that they needed to report to the king immediately, since Rufus had summoned magical beings not recorded in any encyclopedia, beings that even spoke in human language. Together, Rufus, Selbus, and Lala departed and soon arrived at the king's chamber. Standing before the door, Rufus announced that an emergency had occurred and that he was there to report it. The king allowed him in and asked what the matter was. Rufus presented both Burden and Ragios, explaining that he had summoned them using his summoning skill. Burden even repeated her earlier words, declaring that she had arrived. The king was utterly shocked, especially at the sight of the red-eyed, white-feathered dragon. Rufus then introduced Burden, and as both magical beings greeted the king, Ragios demanded that his words be taken seriously. He even glared at the king, warning him that no mercy would be shown if Rufus were harmed. The king hesitated and asked Rufus to explain everything clearly. After Rufus explained, the king realized that his son had summoned magical creatures that were not recorded anywhere. He wondered how Rufus had managed to accomplish such a feat. Rufus replied that he had simply been told he could summon beings by imagining them in his mind, which seemed to be the crucial part. The king glared at him suspiciously, but Ragios quickly fixed his fierce eyes on the king once more, silently warning him not to harm Rufus. Sometime later, Rufus recalled with embarrassment how Ragios had suddenly bitten his father's head. When Rufus had hurriedly asked him to stop, Ragios had actually apologized. The king then announced that Rufus would be appointed as the new guildmaster of the Summoners Guild. Rufus was shocked and immediately wondered what would happen to Selbus. His father explained that Selbus had already agreed to become the vice guildmaster, and that they had been discussing this matter since the moment Rufus's powers had manifested. He declared that Ragios and the other extraordinary beings were invaluable, and Rufus would be responsible for documenting them. He was to write a full report of what had occurred that very day, and continue submitting records of magical creatures in the future. The king also instructed him to assure Ragios that he bore no hostility toward them. Rufus was overwhelmed, realizing how serious the matter had become. But in the end, he was granted permission to keep Ragios and Burden by his side. He also finally understood that this world did not have the custom of keeping pets, something that had nearly killed him from shock when he first learned of it. Now, however, he could legally begin creating his fluffy paradise. Not long after, his mother approached, asking what business he had just concluded with his father. Rufus answered that he had something to report. When she noticed the beasts beside him, she asked about them. Rufus introduced Ragios and Burden, which made her so shocked that she fainted at the sight of the dragon. She was quickly carried to her bed to rest, while Rufus sat quietly nearby, thinking that she was probably not accustomed to seeing magical creatures. Perhaps the sight of them had simply been too much stimulation for her. As Rufus sat quietly, his brothers called out to him, asking where he had gone. They explained that they had heard from the king about Rufus summoning incredible magical creatures, and they wanted to know what those beings in his hands were. Rufus replied that they were the creatures he had summoned. William's eyes lit up with excitement as he asked if he could touch them. When Rufus agreed, he carefully lifted Ragios into his hands. Rufus thought to himself that it was just like William, the scholar, to examine things so eagerly. Leonard, on the other hand, wondered aloud if such creatures were truly safe. Rufus assured him that they would not attack unless he commanded them. Leonard admitted that it was fascinating, while Rufus asked William if he was finished holding Ragios, since Ragios already seemed slightly annoyed. William, however, wanted Rufus to explain in more detail about the creatures. After answering their questions, Rufus eventually grew tired. Feeling drained, he went to sleep. But when he opened his eyes again, he found himself in a strange and unfamiliar place. As he looked around in confusion, a familiar voice came from behind him, the same lady who had once given him the special offer ticket. She greeted him, saying that it had been a long time in the void. Rufus turned, surprised, and immediately recognized her. She revealed that she was not an ordinary person, but the moon god's creature. Rufus was shocked to hear this, that she was the divine being of the moon god's world itself. She explained that she had brought his dying soul from Earth into Moongard. When Rufus asked her the reason, she told him that it was because he would play a role in massively boosting the recognition of summoning skills. Rufus was left confused, wondering what she meant by massively boost. She wondered if Rufus would accept the task. Rufus asked her to wait, saying he did not understand anything and requested her to explain step by step. She questioned if she really needed to explain everything, then assumed the role of a teacher to clarify. She told him that summoning skills were special in the Moonguard world because they used mana that could not be recycled and was permanently consumed. Rufus wondered how they replenished it and grew curious about the illustrations. She explained that the summoning skill itself resolved this, as the magical creatures they summoned sent mana back to the Moonguard. Rufus questioned what he was even seeing at that moment. She further explained that he already knew very few people inherited the summoning skill, and almost no one in Moonguard knew about it. This meant, she continued, that Rufus should understand there would be no new inheritors. She added that, during the skill inheritance ceremony, people were usually granted the skill they truly desired. Rufus wondered if the reason he received the summoning skill was what he thought. She told him he had inherited it because of his deep love for animals. Rufus was shocked, and she went on to say that she had brought someone from Earth because she had heard that Earthlings possessed extraordinary imagination, which turned out to be true. She asked him if he knew that inheriting a skill also enabled them to use magic. Rufus was even more shocked by this revelation. She continued by explaining that there were many types of magic: daily life, offensive, and healing. Rufus felt thrilled that he could now use magic and grew excited. The god shifted the topic back to the transfer of mana. Rufus asked why she could not simply send it directly without using magical creatures. She replied that it was possible, but if he did so, not a single tree or blade of grass would remain in Moonguard. Rufus understood. She revealed that she loved the creatures and people of Moonguard, but if mana dried up, the place would become uninhabitable. That was why, with Rufus's extraordinary love for animals and his imagination, she wanted him to spread the summoning skill and use it as much as possible. Rufus understood and told her to leave it to him. She smiled, saying she was glad to have chosen him and was now counting on him. Rufus began to fall again and after a while woke up in bed, wondering if it had all been a dream. Suddenly, Zagios told him it was not a dream, and that he carried a message from the creature god. Rufus must not forget his promise, and had to uphold it. Rufus realized it was truly not a dream, and then wondered where Peep had gone. Zagios explained that the others had gone ahead of them. Rufus asked why Zagios had not left as well, and Zagios replied that he had been ordered to be Rufus's bodyguard. When Rufus felt sorry for Peep, he learned that he could summon Peep again whenever he wanted. Rufus summoned him, and Peep apologized for keeping him waiting. Rufus noticed that Peep's phrasing had changed, but thought it was fine. Zagios then asked what the plan for the day was, and Rufus decided to introduce them to everyone. He took them to Elatoria's training grounds, where a man was practicing swordsmanship, wanting to show off Zagios and Peep. From a distance, people had already begun murmuring about them, finding them adorable. Zagios asked if Rufus was sure it was not the wrong kind of attention. Leonard appeared, asking if Rufus was there for extra practice, and patted his head appreciatively. Rufus asked him to take a look at Zagios and Peep. Leonard pointed out that even Gilliam had to train hard to become that skilled, and that the early days were full of fun. Just then, Gilliam arrived, saying it sounded like an enjoyable story, and asked to join. Leonard disagreed, saying it was nothing like that. Rufus asked Gilliam if inheriting a skill meant he could also use magic. Gilliam confirmed it, and since Rufus seemed different, Rufus mentioned that he wanted to try out what kind of magic he could use. Gilliam replied that Rufus should ask the Summoners Guild about what type of magic was available to him. As Rufus initially refused, Gilliam asked if he wanted to give it a try there. When Rufus agreed, Gilliam suggested starting with something simple. He demonstrated by summoning light, explaining that it was a daily life spell meant to illuminate their feet. Rufus felt excited when he learned that anyone could use it, thinking it would be perfect for him. Rufus agreed to try, but when he spoke the word light, nothing happened. He wondered why it wasn't working. Gilliam told him to focus more mana into his palm and attempt again. Rufus did as instructed, but still nothing happened. Feeling uneasy, he asked Gilliam to teach him more spells, yet all his attempts failed. Rufus began to wonder if his magical life was already over. He returned to the guild and asked what kind of magic could be used with the summoning skill. The guild members appeared nervous and reluctantly explained that summoners could not use any magical spells at all. Rufus was shocked. He then recalled Gilliam's words, that if the people around him could use magic, he would still be fine. Though he initially felt disheartened, he suddenly realized something and began to laugh. Everyone looked at him with concern, wondering what had happened and if he was all right. Rufus replied that he had a great idea. He explained that if summoners could not cast magic themselves, then their summoned creatures could do it for them. He reasoned that if they needed a spell to create fire and light up an area, they only needed to summon a magical creature with fire abilities. Thinking about what creature would be suitable, he remembered the salamander listed in the encyclopedia and summoned it. The salamander appeared, asking if Rufus had called for him, expressing honor at being summoned. Rufus found the salamander adorable, remarking that its cuteness was entirely different from Ragios and Peep. Lala asked if the salamander wasn't too hot to touch, but Rufus denied it. The salamander also explained that he wasn't in attack mode, which was why he wasn't hot at the moment. To test its abilities, Rufus asked the salamander to burn some objects placed in a container. The salamander easily complied, exciting Rufus and making him realize that it wasn't that he couldn't use magic, it was that his magic manifested through summoning. Selvestel was deeply impressed, admitting that until then he had never considered the broader possibilities of the summoning skill. He confessed that he had always assumed it had limits and had never imagined it could be used in such a way. Lala shared a similar sentiment. Both of them knelt before Rufus, but he asked them to raise their heads. He told them that he wanted their help in proving to the world how useful the summoning skill could be, and suggested that they do their best together. Rufus gave the salamander the name Cayenne, telling him that he was counting on him. The salamander wondered if Cayenne would truly be his name, and Rufus asked if he liked it. The fire Cayenne produced felt unusual, and he mentioned that he still had plenty of power left. Rufus thought about experimenting with different things, and even joked that he might burn down the entire castle just for fun. However, he quickly clarified that he was only kidding. At that moment, his mother appeared behind him, questioning what he had just said. Rufus immediately realized that things were about to go badly for him. He wondered what he should do, as her arrival suddenly turned the place into a battlefield. She asked who the salamander was, and Rufus introduced Cayenne as his newly summoned magical creature. When his mother casually referred to it as a lizard, she fainted again, forcing the other two children to hold her steady. Rufus thought it had been a mistake, realizing the shock was simply too much stimulation for her. His mother reassured everyone that she was fine and told them not to worry. She even apologized, asking Rufus to introduce the others to her as well. Rufus hesitated, but she reminded him that he had not properly introduced them the day before, and she had been curious about them. Rufus then summoned Cayenne and Ragios again, and all three creatures greeted her. She exclaimed in surprise that they could talk and wondered if she could touch them. She first touched Ragios and found him to be wonderfully fluffy. Looking closer, she noticed that Cayenne also had a cute face, and she apologized for being startled earlier. Cayenne replied that it was nothing and that he was honored. She asked them all to take good care of Rufus before leaving. Rufus thought it was surprising and wondered if she had only come just to greet them. Lala, however, was trembling badly. The salamander excused her, and she apologized nervously. Rufus wondered if Lala was afraid of salamanders. Judging by the way she acted, she would not be able to summon one, let alone absorb it, though having fire would be convenient. Peep then mentioned the side chest. Rufus looked at it and thought that perhaps a bird-type creature would work, so he summoned a firebird. When the bird appeared, Rufus found it adorable, possessing a different charm compared to Peep. He felt like a genius for thinking of it, and that the Fluffies were even greater geniuses. He called Lala over to introduce her to the firebird, naming it Ochun. When Lala held it, Rufus realized that she might be able to summon it herself as well. Later, Rufus went to the library, where Selbus was reading books. Rufus wondered what he was doing, and Selbus replied that since they were gathering more magical creatures, he thought they would need an illustrated guide for reporting purposes. Rufus agreed, and asked his brothers if they were good at drawing, but quickly learned they were not. He then thought of Lala, but realized he would need to handle it himself. He drew a salamander, but Cayenne bluntly remarked that the sketch was terrible. Rufus suggested they let the court painter handle it, though he admitted it might be frustrating to rely on others. Instead, he summoned an art bear. The fluffy creature appeared, and Rufus hugged it warmly before naming it Beard. He then wanted to test its power and asked it to draw a Ragios first. Beard drew real Ragios with such accuracy that Rufus was amazed. Selbus commented that both the speed and quality of the drawing would put the court painters to shame. Rufus then asked if Beard could draw in other styles as well. Beard produced a sketch of a girl, and Lala wondered aloud if it was meant to be her. Suddenly, Rufus's father arrived, saying he had heard what had happened.